This happened to me on Thanksgiving Day 2 years ago, and I remember the exact day so clearly because I was sick, really sick. There was a respiratory virus going around at the time, and while I was technically past the fever and contagious stage, I was still miserable. I had constant body chills, couldn't go more than 5 seconds without coughing, and my voice was barely there. Talking felt like a workout. Despite all of that, I had already promised a friend and co-worker, who was leaving town for the holidays, that I would watch her cat. Her cat was older and needed daily medication, and since she lived just a short walk from where we worked, I agreed. I made that promise before I got sick, and even though I felt awful, I wasn't willing to break it. Around the same time, I had been talking with another friend about how we both missed playing tennis and bowling. We'd both played in high school and wanted to get back into it. I had kept my tennis rackets and bowling ball at my dad's house because the dorm I lived in was extremely small. I go to college in a big city and rely entirely on public transportation, so getting around wasn't always easy. Because I was sick over Thanksgiving, I couldn't travel back home like I normally would, but I was determined to get my gear anyway. I only visit my dad a couple of times a year, and if I didn't grab my equipment then, it would be months before we could actually play. So, stubborn as I was, I made a plan. I'd walk to the light rail, ride it to a station closer to my dad's place, and have my brother meet me there with the tennis rackets and bowling ball. After that, I'd head back the same way. On the way home, I'd get off the light rail and take the bus to my friend's place to check on her cat and make sure she got her medication. The problem was the transit system where I live. It's incredibly unreliable. As I waited for the bus, Apple Maps kept telling me it was 1 minute away, only for it to never show up. I'd refresh the app, and suddenly the next bus wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes. Normally I would have just walked. Her place wasn't far from the station. But for context, I was a 19-year-old woman, barely over 5 feet tall, sick, exhausted, and carrying a 13-pound bowling ball, multiple tennis rackets, and a container of Thanksgiving leftovers. By the time I realized how long I'd been waiting, over 30 minutes had passed. It was around 9:00 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. The bus stop was completely empty, and I was the only person there. That's when a car pulled up nearby with a group of men who looked to be in their early to mid-20s. They were laughing and speaking in another language. At first, I assumed they were just friends dropping someone off. After a few minutes, one of the men stepped out of the car and the others drove away. The station itself was pretty large, and I stayed a little distance away from the actual bus stop. I was coughing non-stop and didn't want to be too close to anyone, but standing there alone, sick, tired, and weighed down, I suddenly became very aware of just how vulnerable I was. Even so, the man walked over and sat directly on the bench beside me. At first, I tried not to read into it. I kept my eyes glued to my phone, watching the bus arrival time jump back and forth, and every few seconds I leaned out to scan the street for headlights. A minute or two passed, and then I suddenly felt a weight on my shoulder. Before I could react, the man stood up and wrapped his arm tightly around me. My mind completely shut down. I didn't scream or move, I just froze. I was confused, startled, and struggling to process what was happening. After a moment, he muttered something, asking if I was okay. I quietly told him I was fine and just waiting for the bus. After another minute, he let go and sat back down like nothing had happened. Every alarm in my head was going off, but I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe he heard me coughing and thought I was sick. Maybe he saw me leaning forward and assumed something was wrong. Deep down, I knew those excuses didn't make sense, but I clung to them because staying calm felt safer than panicking. People might wonder why I didn't yell or run. The truth is, he was well over 6 feet tall and easily twice my size. He was also wearing one of those bandana-style face coverings. It stood out, but this was near the end of COVID, so it wasn't completely unheard of. More importantly, we were completely alone at the bus stop. I didn't want to do anything that might provoke him. A few minutes later, he stood up again and wrapped his arm around me for a second time, this time lingering, his hand even moving along my back. I was wearing a thick puffer jacket, which I was grateful for in that moment. When I saw my bus approaching, I stayed completely still, telling myself that everything would be over once I got on. As the bus pulled up, I slipped out of his grip and quietly said something like, "My bus is here." He responded in a way that made it clear he intended to follow me on. I know I should have told the driver, but I could barely speak without coughing, and nothing like this had ever happened to me before. I was panicking. Once I boarded, I made a deliberate choice to stand. Because of his size, I knew he'd have to sit, and if I sat first, he would sit right next to me. Once he wasn't towering over me anymore, I messaged a friend and tried to think. I considered calling the police, but I was afraid he would hear me, and I didn't know if he had a weapon. While I had been trapped under his grip earlier, I was already planning my next move. I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't go to my friend's place. I couldn't shake the feeling that the group of men who had dropped him off might somehow be connected to him. That thought alone made everything feel more dangerous. The stop right before my friend's place happened to be my work stop. I worked at a restaurant inside a large outdoor shopping center, and it was around 9:30 p.m. Even though the stores officially closed at 9:00, I knew the entire center was covered in security cameras and patrolled by security. I also knew my coworkers would still be inside finishing up closing duties. The only problem was that the front doors would be locked. The back employee entrance would still be open, but to get there I'd have to pass through the outdoor trash enclosure first, and then punch in the code on the back door. It wasn't ideal, but it was the safest option I had. When the bus stopped, the man got off with me and immediately grabbed my shoulder again, this time gripping even tighter. I forced myself to move slowly, taking small, careful steps. I was terrified that if I tried to sprint too soon, he'd react before I could make it inside. As we got closer to work, all I could think about was whether I'd be fast enough to break free and make it through both doors before he caught me. Then, suddenly, everything lined up. As we reached the back of the restaurant, the door to the trash enclosure was propped open, and one of the chefs and another coworker were standing there talking with the back door held open. That was my moment. His grip loosened just enough as we walked, and I slipped out of it and ran past him. I tried to tell my coworker that a man was following me and to shut the door. Even though I could barely get the words out, he reacted immediately and slammed it closed. Less than 2 seconds later, the handle started shaking violently, followed by loud banging on the door. I explained as best I could that I didn't know the man and that he had followed me from the bus stop. We called mall security right away. While we waited, we could see him pacing back and forth outside the restaurant through the windows. After a few minutes, he walked into the ice cream shop directly across from us. Security arrived shortly after and asked me a few questions. The coworker who had been at the door ended up driving me to my friend's place so I could check on her cat, and then drove me home. A few days later, my manager told me that mall security wanted to know if I wanted to press charges. I said I wasn't sure yet. More than anything, I just wanted to know the man's name and what he claimed he was doing there. But my manager never followed up, and I never heard anything else. To this day, I have no idea what that man wanted, though I definitely have my suspicions. I honestly pushed the whole experience out of my mind until recently, when that same friend asked if I could watch her cat again for Thanksgiving. That one question brought everything flooding back. This happened in early December 2 years ago, when I drove up into the mountains to visit an old friend I hadn't seen in a very long time. For the sake of the story, his name is Scott, and my real name is Jeremy. We'd been close friends since middle school, but after graduation, life pulled us in different directions. He moved with his family to a small mountain town, while I stayed in New York City for work. There was never a falling out or bad blood. We just slowly stopped being part of each other's daily lives. So when Scott reached out of nowhere and suggested I come visit for a weekend, I felt a mix of nostalgia and excitement. He told me it was the perfect time to come up because the snow made everything feel quiet, rustic, and peaceful. I thought it sounded nice, a chance to reconnect and catch up after all those years. The drive up the mountain took longer than expected because I had to go slow on the icy roads. There were barely any other cars around, and since it was December, the sun went down early, around 4:00 p.m. By the time I reached the area where he lived, it was completely dark. Scott's house was one of those older wooden homes built into the side of the mountain. There were only a few other houses nearby, all spread far apart. It was a great area for skiing, if only I actually knew how to ski. When I pulled into the driveway and Scott came outside to greet me, I immediately felt like something was off. I hadn't seen him in years, so at first I told myself I was probably just misremembering how he looked or sounded. But the way he spoke was noticeably different, slower than I remembered. He paused a lot mid-sentence, like he was losing his train of thought. He helped carry my bag inside, The house itself was warm, but strangely empty. There wasn't much furniture, just a couch, a table, a couple of chairs, and some antique-looking decorations on the walls. He told me I could sleep on the couch since it folded out into a pull-out bed, which I was fine with. Across from the couch was a long, dark hallway that led to a bathroom and 2 empty guest rooms. Scott explained that the rooms were empty because the house used to belong to his grandparents, who had recently passed away, and that he now lived there alone. The hallway had no light at the end and all the doors were open. From where I sat, it looked like a pitch black rectangle stretching into the back of the house. There was nothing obviously scary about it, but it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. That first night, we talked a bit about old memories, but even that felt strange. Scott's demeanor was awkward, and he barely made eye contact. I also noticed that he kept glancing toward the hallway. I brushed it off, telling myself that living alone in the mountains for years could make anyone a little odd. When it was time to sleep, he went upstairs to his bedroom, and I set up the couch. I left a light on near the hallway because the darkness bothered me. I felt a little ridiculous doing it, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I fell asleep, but around 20:00 in the morning, I woke up to a loud thumping sound from upstairs. Then I realized it was footsteps, fast ones. It sounded like someone sprinting from one end of the room to the other, stopping, and then sprinting again. The noise went on for about 20 seconds and then stopped completely. I waited, expecting to hear a door open or something else, but the house went dead silent. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though I was extremely shaken. The next day was even stranger. Scott seemed distracted the entire time. He barely talked, barely ate, and whenever I asked if he was okay, he would just nod without saying a word. None of it made sense to me. He was the one who invited me up for the weekend, and I assumed it was because he wanted to reconnect and catch up. Instead, it felt like I was intruding on something I didn't understand. Throughout the day, I noticed him walking down the hallway at least 5 different times. I never followed him or asked what he was doing. Since there was a bathroom at the end of the hall, I told myself that was probably where he was going, even though I never once heard a toilet flush or water running. That night, the weather took a turn and a full snowstorm rolled in. The wind slammed against the house hard enough to make the walls tremble slightly. I actually loved it. Being snowed in somewhere warm and quiet has always felt comforting to me. I lay on the couch scrolling through my phone for about an hour, then eventually went to sleep. Around 20:00 in the morning, I woke up again. This time, I heard a soft scraping sound. It was coming from somewhere down the hallway, like something being dragged slowly across the wooden floor. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, there was a sharp tap on the wall behind me, like someone flicked it with their finger. I turned my head and looked down the hallway. I hadn't left the light on that night, so it was completely dark. I didn't want to get up. I forced myself to roll onto my other side and tried to ignore it. Old house, I kept telling myself. Old houses make noise. Eventually, I fell back asleep and woke up again in the morning. The third night was the worst. By then, I felt uneasy in the house overall. I kept catching Scott staring at me for just a little too long, without saying anything, like he was waiting to see if I'd noticed something. I seriously considered leaving early, but the snowstorm wasn't supposed to clear until morning. After dinner, Scott went upstairs earlier than usual. I stayed on the couch scrolling through my phone, questioning why I even came on this trip in the first place. Eventually, I set up the couch and lay down. I closed my eyes trying to fall asleep, but around 2 a.m. in the morning again, I woke up for no clear reason. My eyes opened, but the rest of my body wouldn't move. I'd heard of sleep paralysis before, but I had never experienced it myself. It felt like being conscious inside a body that had completely shut down. I couldn't move my fingers. I couldn't move my arms. I could only move my eyes. Panic started to creep in until something made it so much worse. I noticed movement at the far end of the hallway. At first, it was so dark that I couldn't tell if what I was seeing was real. Then, slowly, it became clear. Scott was standing at the very end of the hallway. I could only see his outline. His face was swallowed by the darkness. His arms hung at his sides, and he stood perfectly still, like he had been there for a long time just watching me. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I tried to move anything, but my body stayed frozen. I didn't even feel like I was breathing. All I could do was stare. He stood there for what felt like a full minute, completely motionless. Then, without any warning, he slowly turned to his right and walked into the guest room at the end of the hallway. disappearing into the darkness without making a sound. As soon as he was gone, my body slowly started to come back online. First my fingers twitched, then my arms, and finally I was able to sit up. When I fully snapped out of it, I was shaking and drenched in sweat. I kept telling myself it had to be a dream or some kind of hallucination. I knew sleep paralysis could cause vivid visual experiences, but deep down something felt wrong. My gut told me this wasn't just in my head. I whispered Scott's name, half expecting him to answer. There was nothing, no movement, no sound. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I stood up and forced myself to walk down the hallway toward the room he had entered. Each step felt heavy. When I stepped inside the guest room, it looked empty at first. But then I noticed someone standing in the far corner near the window. I could see the outline of a person facing outside, completely still. I couldn't tell if it was Scott or someone else, but it didn't matter. The sight alone was terrifying. I backed out slowly and then ran upstairs to Scott's bedroom. I found him asleep in his bed, completely knocked out. I shook him awake, and he looked confused and irritated, like he had no idea why I was waking him. When I tried to explain what I had seen, he refused to go downstairs. I begged him to believe me, told him there was someone else in the house, but he wouldn't even look toward the stairs. He didn't say anything at first, but his expression changed in a way that scared me more than words could. He looked like he already knew. I finally asked him directly, "Scott, who is that downstairs?" He just looked at me and shrugged. That was it. I was done. I didn't care about the snowstorm or the time of night anymore. I ran downstairs, grabbed my bag, and threw my things together as fast as I could. I kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to see that figure standing there again. All I wanted was to be out of that house. When I stepped outside, the freezing air almost felt relieving. I brushed the snow off my car, got inside, and drove away as quickly as I could. As I backed out of the driveway, I made the mistake of looking up at the house one last time. In the window of the room at the end of the hallway, I saw a silhouette standing there watching. I'm certain it was the same figure I had seen before. That was the last time I ever saw Scott's house. After that weekend, he stopped responding to my texts. When I started to worry that something had happened to him, I threatened to call in a wellness check. Eventually, he replied with just 2 words, "I'm fine." He never responded again, and I stopped reaching out. That wasn't the same Scott I grew up with. Whatever happened to him, and whoever or whatever was in that house, I want no part of it. I'd be lying if I said it doesn't still terrify me.